I arrived home late on a Tuesday evening, exhausted but eager to be back. The week-long business trip to Chicago had been productive but grueling, and all I wanted was a quiet night with my wife, Jennifer. We'd been married for almost 10 years, and I was excited to tell her about my latest promotion, which came with a raise substantial enough for us to finally plan that anniversary trip we'd been talking about. The house was quiet when I pulled into the driveway. Jennifer's car was there, and the lights were off, which was strange since she usually stayed up late reading or watching something on Netflix until I got back. I shook it off. She was probably just asleep early for once. I decided I'd surprise her with a quiet kiss, maybe even wake her up gently to share the good news. But as I stepped out of the car, something small caught my eye. A pair of footprints marked the muddy patch near the garage, leading up to the front door. At first, I thought nothing of it, probably just a delivery driver leaving a package. But as I looked closer, I realized these were boot prints, and they were fresh. Maybe it was paranoia, but an uneasy feeling started gnawing at me. I brushed it off, reasoning it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me after a long flight. I unlocked the front door quietly and stepped inside, hoping to sneak upstairs without waking Jennifer. Once inside, though, I noticed something that set off another alarm. The living room smelled faintly of an unfamiliar cologne. Jennifer had always been sensitive to strong smells, so she rarely wore perfume, and I certainly didn't wear cologne. My heart began to race. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that maybe the scent was left over from a visitor earlier in the day. My hands clenched and unclenched as I crossed the room. I noticed the faint glow of a light coming from under our bedroom door. It didn't make sense. If she was asleep, she would have turned off the lights, right? I inched closer, the uneasy feeling turning into full-blown dread. And then I heard it. A muffled voice, followed by a soft laugh, Jennifer's laugh. Only, it wasn't the kind of laugh she usually shared with me. This laugh was flirtatious, full of warmth that I hadn't heard directed toward me in a long time. I froze outside the door, feeling like the ground had just shifted under my feet. I should have burst in right then, demanded answers, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, listening to the sound of a man's voice mingling with Jennifer's. My mind was racing, flipping through 1,000 possibilities. Maybe it was an old friend visiting, or a late-night conversation that had gotten a bit too friendly. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I don't remember how long I stood there, rooted in place, trying to piece together an explanation that didn't involve betrayal. But eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I let go of the doorknob, turned, and retreated to the kitchen. I collapsed into one of the chairs at the dining table, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd just heard. The laughter continued upstairs, haunting and painfully familiar. My phone was still in my pocket, and I pulled it out, scrolling through my text messages with Jennifer, trying to find any hint, any clue I might have missed. There were only the usual messages about groceries, laundry, I love you, texts that suddenly felt meaningless. How had I missed this? A wave of nausea hit me, and I had to steady myself, gripping the edge of the table. I sat there, fighting back the urge to run upstairs and confront them. I wanted to scream, to demand how she could do this to me. But the rational part of my mind held me back. I needed to think, to gather myself, to figure out my next move. I wasn't ready for whatever explanation she tried to give. Instead, I quietly left the house. I needed air, space, anything to calm the storm inside me. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind racing through questions that had no answers. Was this the first time? How long had she been seeing this man? And why hadn't I seen any signs? It was well past midnight when I finally returned. The strange car was gone, and the house was quiet. I went up to the bedroom, found Jennifer asleep in our bed, looking as if she hadn't just shattered my world hours earlier. She looked peaceful, and in some twisted way, it hurt even more. I lay awake that night, listening to her soft breathing beside me. I wanted to shake her awake, to confront her then and there. But I held back. I needed proof, something concrete. If I was going to confront her, I wanted to be prepared for whatever lies she might try to spin. The next day, I went to work as if nothing had happened. My coworkers congratulated me on the promotion, patted me on the back, all while I kept a forced smile on my face, pretending everything was fine. but inside, I was breaking. I could barely focus on anything as I replayed the previous night over and over in my mind, questioning every interaction, every word Jennifer and I had shared in recent months. I decided to do some digging. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I had to find out the truth. That evening, when Jennifer went out to run errands, I seized my chance. I went through her phone, scrolling through her messages and social media, looking for anything suspicious. But she was careful. There was nothing incriminating, nothing that hinted at the man I'd heard in our bedroom. Frustrated, I started thinking about other ways to get proof. I ordered a few small cameras and a voice recorder online, devices discreet enough that she wouldn't notice. Over the next few days, I set them up around the house, one in the living room, one in the bedroom, and another in her car. I hated myself for doing it, but I felt like I was losing my mind. I needed confirmation, one way or another. The waiting was excruciating. Every time I looked at her, I felt a mix of anger, heartbreak, and longing. She was still my wife, still the woman I'd loved for nearly a decade. And part of me wanted desperately to believe I was wrong, that I'd misinterpreted everything. But each time she smiled at me, each time she kissed me goodnight, I felt the sting of betrayal just beneath the surface. After a few days, the recording started to reveal things I hadn't wanted to believe. The first night I checked, I found nothing but normal conversations between us. But by the third night, I caught snippets of her whispering on the phone late at night when she thought I was asleep. She was speaking softly, laughing occasionally, the same laugh I'd heard that night. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage from the hidden cameras, growing increasingly anxious. And then, finally, I saw him. The man who had been in my home, in my bedroom, with my wife. He was younger than me, maybe in his mid-30s, with a confident swagger that made my blood boil. He was comfortable in my house, like he'd been there before. Watching him walk around my home like it was his own was almost more than I could bear. I gritted my teeth, feeling a surge of anger so strong that I had to stop myself from smashing the laptop screen. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but it didn't work. I needed more answers. I started tracking their meetings, watching each interaction on the footage. They were cautious but not cautious enough, slipping up in small ways that confirmed what I'd feared. Jennifer's betrayal went beyond a single moment of weakness. This was a full-blown affair, something that had been building for who knows how long. I couldn't believe how blind I'd been. Every late night she'd brushed off as work, every girls' night out that had left me with the kids, it all took on a new, sinister meaning. How many times had I trusted her completely while she was out with him? One evening, as I was reviewing footage from the previous week, I found something that finally shattered whatever was left of my restraint. In one video, they were sitting in my living room, talking in hushed tones. Jennifer leaned into him, and he brushed a hand across her cheek, whispering something I couldn't hear. She laughed, then looked around nervously, as if worried I might come home. And then she said something that made my stomach turn. "We just need to wait a little longer, and then we can finally be together." Completely. The man nodded, taking her hand in his. "Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" he asked, a hint of anxiety in his voice. Jennifer shook her head, smiling. "No, he has no idea. I've been careful. It's just a few more weeks, and we'll have everything we wanted." Everything they wanted? The words rang in my ears, cutting deeper than any physical blow. She was planning something that involved ending our marriage, but on her terms. I realized that this wasn't just an affair. She was calculating, plotting to leave me, but in a way that would benefit her. I felt a sickening clarity settle over me. She was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to end things, maybe even trying to secure her claim on everything we'd built together. And I'd been so blind, so trusting, that I'd let her play me like a fool. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed beside Jennifer, feeling the weight of betrayal settle deeper into my bones. I'd thought her affair was just a fling, a reckless choice driven by some unmet emotional need. But this was different. The way she talked about waiting, about wanting everything, they weren't just the words of someone who was in over their head. There was a plan here, something calculated, and it had me at the center like a pawn in her game. The promotion I'd just received had come with a sizable raise, which I'd been excited to share with her. But now, that excitement was gone, replaced by a gnawing suspicion. Jennifer knew about the raise, and she'd already started talking about investing some of our money, hinting that she had ideas for growing our savings. I'd brushed it off, thinking she was just being proactive. But with this new perspective, I realized she was probably angling to secure as much financial control as possible. My mind went back to our last anniversary, about 6 months ago. We'd had a quiet dinner at home. I'd surprised her with a necklace she'd wanted, and I remember the look on her face, like she'd expected something bigger. I'd laughed it off, promising that when I got promoted, we'd plan that trip to the Bahamas she'd always dreamed about. She'd smiled, but there was something behind it, something I couldn't place at the time. Now, that smile felt like it hid 1,000 secrets. I decided I needed to know more before confronting her. If she was after my money, I needed to find out exactly what she was planning. I spent the next few days pretending everything was normal. I went to work, smiled at Jennifer, and played the role of the oblivious husband. Meanwhile, I started digging deeper. One afternoon, while Jennifer was out with friends, I called my bank. I'd rarely checked our accounts. Jennifer had always been the one handling our finances. She'd insisted on it, claiming she had a knack for budgeting and investments. But now, I wanted to look at the accounts myself. When the bank teller began listing recent transactions, I felt the blood drain from my face. There were withdrawals I hadn't authorized, large ones. Money was moving out of our joint savings and into an account I didn't recognize. I asked the teller if he could provide any more information, but he said I'd need Jennifer's permission since it was her personal account. Personal account? We'd agreed, years ago, that we'd keep everything joint. So when did she open a separate account, and why? The teller's voice seemed distant as he continued to list out the transactions. All I could think about was how Jennifer had somehow managed to hide this from me, systematically siphoning money out of our savings. After I hung up, I sat there, stunned. The pieces were starting to come together. She was siphoning money, meeting with her lover, planning to leave. But it wasn't just about leaving me. She wanted to drain me dry, to walk away with as much of our assets as possible. The vacation she was angling for wasn't a trip to the Bahamas with me. It was an escape plan, a final chapter in the story she'd been writing behind my back. That night, I tried to act normally around her, though my mind was racing. I watched her laugh over dinner, make small talk about her day, and even tell me she loved me before bed. The words felt like venom now, sinking into my skin and poisoning every memory I had of her. I could barely look at her, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed more proof, more than just the suspicious bank transactions and her whispers with her lover. If I was going to protect myself, I had to know exactly what she was planning. Over the next few days, I went further. I hired a private investigator to track her movements, feeling a sick satisfaction in knowing that I'd finally be able to see her secrets laid bare. The investigator sent me updates every evening, detailing where Jennifer went, who she met, and how long she stayed. As I read each report, it felt like watching the pieces of a puzzle come together, each one forming a clearer picture of the woman I thought I knew. The investigator's final report confirmed my worst fears. Jennifer had been meeting with a divorce attorney, someone who specialized in high-asset separations. She'd been carefully planning every step, and from the looks of it, she was preparing to leave me as soon as she could secure her financial position. My promotion had been the perfect opportunity, a sudden influx of cash she could siphon off before disappearing with her lover. My chest tightened with rage. She was going to bleed me dry, take everything we'd built together, and leave me with nothing. And the worst part? She thought she'd gotten away with it. She thought I was just a clueless husband, happily ignorant while she moved pieces behind the scenes. But now, I had an advantage. I knew what she was planning, and I wasn't about to let her win. I began carefully preparing my own plan. I started by setting up a new bank account in my name only, quietly transferring some of my salary there each month. I reached out to a lawyer of my own, explaining the situation and asking for advice on how to protect my assets. My lawyer was thorough, advising me on steps I could take to keep Jennifer from claiming more than her fair share in the event of a divorce. My lawyer's recommendation was to collect as much evidence as possible of her affair and her secret financial activities. He told me that if I could prove infidelity, especially with financial manipulation involved, it could affect the division of assets significantly. I felt a small sense of relief. If she was going to try to ruin me, I would make sure it backfired. Meanwhile, I continued acting like the perfect husband. I even planned a weekend getaway for us, hoping to lull her into a false sense of security. I wanted her to think that I was still clueless, that her plan was progressing smoothly. She seemed surprised when I suggested the trip but quickly agreed, probably thinking it was a way to keep me distracted while she finalized her scheme. On the drive up to the cabin I'd rented, she was cheerful, chatting about all the things we could do together over the weekend. She acted like the woman I'd fallen in love with, and for a moment, it almost felt real. But then I remembered the bank account, the lawyer, the affair, and the illusion shattered. When we arrived at the cabin, I set up a few of the recording devices I'd brought with me. I wanted to catch her in a private moment, something I could use in court if necessary. That night, after we went to bed, I waited until she was asleep before taking her phone from the nightstand. This time, I didn't just scroll through messages. I went deeper, accessing files, contacts, and even her private emails. My heart pounded as I found email exchanges with her lover, detailing their plans to leave together, instructions on which assets she could claim, and a clear timeline for when they would both disappear. She'd even written out a rough estimate of our total savings and assets, with notes on which accounts she'd already accessed and which she still needed to siphon. It was like reading a cold, calculated blueprint for my own destruction. She wanted everything, the house, the savings, even part of my retirement fund, and she was going to take it all without a second thought. I returned the phone to her nightstand and lay awake in the dark, the weight of everything crashing down on me. She was a stranger, a manipulator who'd only stayed with me for what she could gain. All the years I'd spent loving her, building a life with her, it had been nothing but a convenient setup for her to use and discard. As I lay there, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. It was time to act. Back at home, I moved swiftly. I sent all the evidence I'd gathered to my lawyer, who assured me it would be enough to mount a strong defense against her claims. My lawyer recommended filing for divorce first, which would put me in a better position to control the narrative. Jennifer wouldn't know what hit her. A few days later, after Jennifer had gone out for yoga, I filed the paperwork. I left a copy of the filing on the kitchen table, along with printouts of her emails with her lover, the bank statements showing her secret account, and a note that simply read, "I know everything." When she returned home that evening, her face went pale as she walked into the kitchen and saw the stack of documents waiting for her. She looked at me, her expression a mix of shock and fury, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "I trusted you," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "I trusted you with my life, my love, my future. And this is how you repay me?" Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked down at the documents, then back up at me, as if searching for some way to talk herself out of this. But we both knew there was nothing she could say. "You were going to leave, weren't you?" I continued, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and pain. "Take everything, drain our accounts, run off with him. You didn't think I'd find out, did you?" She finally spoke, her voice weak, almost pleading. "It's not what it looks like. Don't lie to me," I snapped. "I know exactly what it is. I've seen the emails, the texts, the bank statements. You were planning this for months." She tried to reach out, her voice breaking, but I backed away. "Don't. Just don't." In the end, Jennifer's carefully crafted plan collapsed around her. I filed for divorce with the evidence on my side, and she ended up with far less than she'd intended. The house, the majority of our savings, even her reputation among friends and family, it was all gone. She became the villain in her own story, the one who tried to take everything and lost it all. As I watched her walk away for the last time, I felt a strange sense of relief. The betrayal still stung, but I knew I'd survived, stronger and wiser than before. The life I'd built wasn't gone. It was just waiting to be rebuilt, this time without her lies dragging me down. And as for Jennifer, she'd gotten exactly what she deserved. After Jennifer walked out that day, part of me thought it was over, that I'd won. But as the initial shock wore off, the bitterness remained, gnawing at me. She'd nearly ruined my life, draining me financially, tarnishing my trust, and plotting behind my back. Every time I thought of how close she'd come to getting away with it, my anger flared anew. I couldn't just let her walk away without consequences. I wanted her to feel every ounce of betrayal she dealt me. But a straightforward confrontation wasn't enough. I needed something more precise, something that would sting and linger. I wanted her to experience the same paranoia, the same helplessness I'd felt when I first discovered her betrayal. If she turned our marriage into a game, then I'd play too, only this time. I'd be the one in control. I started by researching methods of subtle surveillance. I didn't want to do anything illegal. I wasn't out to break the law or stoop to her level. But I wanted to get as close as possible. I needed to understand her next moves, her finances, her communications, everything. I wanted to know who she was meeting, where she was spending her time, and, most importantly, what she was planning now that her scheme had fallen apart. A friend of mine, Tom, worked in cybersecurity, and he was more than happy to lend a hand. After a few drinks one night, I shared a sanitized version of my situation, leaving out names and specifics. Tom had always been a bit of a hacker at heart, so when I asked him how someone might go about tracking an unfaithful spouse, he perked up, eager to share his knowledge. "There's a lot you can do without breaking the law," he said, leaning in conspiratorially. "For starters, you can use open-source intelligence. It's amazing what you can find with the right tools: social media tracking, phone records, even some email metadata. But you need patience and finesse." He told me about apps that could legally track someone's social media posts, monitor public activity, and track changes in financial transactions, all through publicly accessible information. There were forums dedicated to techniques for uncovering hidden accounts and transactions. He also mentioned discrete tracking devices, legal in most states if placed on a car you own, which would allow me to track her movements in real time. The more he talked, the more excited I became. This wasn't just revenge. This was a chance to understand Jennifer's motives, to uncover the depth of her deception, and to make sure she couldn't try to come after me again. I thanked Tom, and over the next few days, I set up everything I needed to turn the tables on her. The first step was installing a small GPS tracker in the trunk of her car. I'd done it while she was in the shower one morning before she moved out. I wanted to see where she went now that she was on her own, to know who she was meeting and whether she'd reconnected with her lover. The tracker would send updates to an app on my phone, allowing me to follow her movements at any time of day. Next, I set up alerts for any changes in her social media activity using a tool Tom had recommended. Anytime she posted, updated her relationship status, or tagged herself somewhere, I'd get a notification. I wasn't just interested in her public posts, though. I was also watching for her likes, comments, and friend requests. Any sign that she was reconnecting with her old circle or moving on to a new one. But the most satisfying part was what I did with her phone. During our weekend getaway at the cabin, I'd found her burner phone, the one she used to communicate with her lover, and managed to clone it. The clone allowed me to see every text, every call, every message she sent. It felt like poetic justice. She tried to keep me in the dark, and now I could see everything she tried to hide. For the first week, there wasn't much to report. She spent most of her time at her new apartment, probably licking her wounds and figuring out her next steps. Her social media posts were sporadic, mostly vague updates about new beginnings and fresh starts, the kind of nonsense people post when they're trying to reinvent themselves. But by the second week, things started to get interesting. One Friday night, the GPS tracker showed her driving across town to an upscale restaurant. She hadn't mentioned dating anyone new, but I had a feeling she hadn't given up on her old lover, even after the divorce papers. Sure enough, when I checked the clone phone, I found text from a familiar number. It was him, her lover, Daniel. They were making plans to meet up, discussing reservations, and, most interestingly, talking about money. I scrolled through the messages, my pulse quickening as I realized what they were plotting. Jennifer was planning to ask for alimony, claiming that she couldn't support herself after our divorce. She was going to argue that I'd left her with nothing, even though she'd siphoned thousands from our accounts. She was setting up a sob story, and she wanted Daniel to help her stage it. The rage boiled up in me again, but this time, I had a plan. I wasn't just going to stop her from getting what she wanted. I was going to expose her, ruin her reputation, make sure that everyone knew who she really was. The following week, I started laying the groundwork. First, I gathered every piece of evidence I had: the bank statements, the messages with her lover, the financial documents showing how much she'd taken from our accounts. I saved everything to a secure drive and then went a step further, creating a detailed timeline of her actions. I documented every instance of her deceit, every lie she'd told, every dollar she'd stolen. I wanted it all neatly organized, ready to present at the right moment. Next, I reached out to a friend of mine, Mark, who worked as a journalist at a local news outlet. Mark and I had been friends since college, and I trusted him to be discreet. I gave him a high-level overview of the situation, careful not to reveal too much. "Let's just say I have a story you might find interesting," I hinted. "It involves financial fraud, betrayal, and a well-known figure in the community." Mark was intrigued and promised to keep the story on hold until I gave the go-ahead. This way, if Jennifer tried to drag me through the mud publicly, or worse, take legal action, I'd have a counterstrike ready. If she wanted to play dirty, she'd have to deal with the fallout. But I wasn't done yet. I started sending anonymous tips to a few local gossip sites, suggesting that a prominent community member, without naming Jennifer, was involved in a scandalous affair and financial manipulation scheme. I knew it would get people talking, and when the truth came out, the public would already be primed to see Jennifer in a negative light. For the next few weeks, I watched her movements carefully. The GPS tracker showed her spending a lot of time at Daniel's apartment, and their messages grew increasingly bold. They talked about how they'd spend the money, joked about me, even fantasized about the future they'd build together once they had drained me dry. The arrogance in their messages was staggering. They genuinely believed they'd outsmarted me. Finally, the day came when she filed her alimony claim. I received the paperwork at my office, a thick stack detailing her supposed financial hardships and her request for monthly payments. She'd painted a picture of herself as a victim, left destitute by a heartless husband who'd abandoned her with no means of support. It was laughable, really, considering she'd taken thousands from me before the divorce. But I'd been waiting for this moment. The court date was set for 2 weeks later, and I spent every minute preparing. I had all the evidence organized, my lawyer fully briefed, and Mark, the journalist, ready to publish the story if needed. When the day finally arrived, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I wasn't nervous or angry anymore. I was ready. In the courtroom, Jennifer looked every bit the part of the scorned ex-wife, dressed conservatively, her eyes downcast as she made her case. She recounted our marriage, twisting details to make herself sound sympathetic, fragile. She cried as she talked about how I'd emotionally abandoned her, how she had no idea how she would survive without my support. But then it was my turn. My lawyer calmly presented the evidence, starting with the bank transactions showing the thousands she'd funneled into her personal account. He followed with the cloned messages between her and Daniel, detailing their affair and their plans to drain me financially. Each new piece of evidence landed like a punch, and I watched as Jennifer's face went from confident to panicked. Finally, my lawyer played the recordings from her burner phone. The courtroom was silent as everyone listened to Jennifer and Daniel discussing their scheme, laughing about how easily they'd manipulated me. Jennifer's face turned pale, her hands shaking as she realized there was no way out. When it was over, the judge looked at her with barely concealed disdain. He denied her alimony claim on the spot, calling her actions manipulative and fraudulent. As she walked out of the courtroom, she looked back at me, her eyes filled with fury and fear. I knew she'd lost more than just money that day. She'd lost the facade she'd worked so hard to maintain. The next morning, the story broke. Mark's article detailed Jennifer's affair, her financial manipulations, and her failed attempt to claim alimony under false pretenses. By the end of the day, she was the talk of the town, her name synonymous with deceit. Friends, family, colleagues, everyone saw her for who she really was. Jennifer tried to go after me legally, but her attempts were futile. She lost her job, her reputation, and eventually, her relationship with Daniel. He abandoned her once he realized there was no money to be had, leaving her alone to deal with the wreckage of her life. In the end, I didn't just get justice. I got my life back, free from the weight of her betrayal. I moved on, rebuilt, and eventually found peace, knowing that the woman who had tried to destroy me had, in the end, destroyed only herself. After Jennifer's failed attempt to get alimony and the humiliating article that exposed her deceit, I thought I'd finally found closure. But revenge, I discovered, was addictive. Watching her life crumble was satisfying, but there was still a nagging thought that it wasn't enough. She'd nearly succeeded in ruining me, and a simple public shaming and courtroom loss didn't feel like the true justice she deserved. I wanted her to know the full depth of betrayal, to experience the same kind of heartbreak, shock, and helplessness she put me through. So I decided to keep going, to push her further. But this time, I'd make her think that she was the one in control. I started by reaching out to her. After weeks of radio silence, she was surprised to hear from me, and she sounded hesitant, even nervous, on the phone. I kept my tone friendly, understanding, even apologetic. I told her I wanted to clear the air, that maybe we'd both been too hasty. I hinted that I was still feeling lonely, that maybe we'd made a mistake by ending things so bitterly. I knew she'd see this as an opportunity. Jennifer was the kind of person who thrived on manipulation, and I knew she wouldn't be able to resist trying to draw me back in. At first, she played it cool, pretending to still be hurt by how things had ended, making me work to earn her forgiveness. I let her have her little victory, feeding her lines she wanted to hear. I told her I missed the good times, that I regretted how we'd grown apart, that I was willing to move past her betrayal if she could do the same. I even hinted that maybe we could try to reconcile. It was pathetic, and I hated myself a little for pretending, but it was all part of the plan. I could tell she was intrigued. She tried to play innocent, acting as if she hadn't intentionally sabotaged our marriage. She even managed to squeeze out a few tears, talking about how lost she'd been, how she'd made a mistake. Every insincere word she uttered only reinforced my determination. This wasn't reconciliation. It was just the next step in her downfall. As we started meeting for coffee and drinks, I planted the seeds of a fake reconciliation, dangling just enough of a chance to keep her hooked. I fed her a story about needing to rebuild trust, that if we were ever going to be together again, we'd have to put the past behind us completely. Jennifer was wary at first, but her greed soon won out. I could see it in her eyes. She was imagining how she might worm her way back into my life and my finances. She thought she'd found a way to salvage her public image, to rewrite the narrative after the disastrous court case and the article that had exposed her. She thought she was clever, that she'd found a way back in. But in reality, she was playing right into my hands. After a few weeks, I suggested that we go to therapy. I made a show of being willing to work through our issues, hoping that this would help her drop her guard. She agreed, probably seeing it as another way to manipulate me. She didn't know that I'd already clued the therapist in on our history, explaining Jennifer's lies and her sociopathic tendencies. In our sessions, the therapist and I gently steered Jennifer to share her own view of our relationship, her twisted logic, her self-centered perspective on our past. She revealed details she probably didn't mean to, showing glimpses of the real Jennifer beneath her carefully constructed facade. With every session, the therapist kept a careful record, and after enough sessions, we had an extensive documentation of her manipulative tendencies, her admissions of guilt, her distorted view of our relationship. It was a goldmine, something that could serve as irrefutable evidence of her twisted nature should I ever need it in the future. But even that wasn't enough. I wanted her to reach her own breaking point. After a few months of playing the long game, Jennifer was convinced we were on the path to reconciliation. I could see her falling back into her old habits, treating me as someone she could manipulate, slowly starting to talk about our future and hinting at ways we could combine our finances again. She believed that she was inching her way back to the comfortable life she once had. That's when I introduced the final phase of my plan. One evening over dinner, I casually mentioned that I'd started a new investment project, a small tech startup I was backing with my promotion money. I hinted that the company had incredible potential, that early investors were expected to see huge returns. Jennifer's eyes lit up as I spoke, and I could practically see the calculations running through her mind. I knew she couldn't resist the lure of easy money. "I'd love for us to invest in something together," I said smoothly, watching her reaction. "If we're rebuilding our lives, it might be nice to share this success with you." Jennifer agreed eagerly, claiming she wanted to make things right. She began pushing me to tell her more about the project, dropping hints that she could contribute, that we could both be part of it. After a few days, I relented, telling her I'd love for her to invest, but only after she made an initial commitment. I played it off as a precaution, telling her that we need to make sure we're serious before we could go any further. I gave her the number, a sizable amount, enough to hurt her but not enough to scare her off. She agreed quickly, likely thinking this was her chance to rebuild the financial security she'd lost in the divorce. I watched as she transferred the money to my account, believing she was on the fast track back into my life and my finances. I could barely keep from laughing as I saw the amount appear in my bank. Once the money cleared, I went dark. For the next week, I ignored her calls and texts. She sent frantic messages, demanding to know where her investment had gone, accusing me of betrayal, threatening to ruin me. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded copies of our therapy notes, bank transfers, and text messages to my lawyer, preparing them as a failsafe if she tried to come after me legally. Then, I waited, knowing her desperation would drive her to do something reckless. Sure enough, Jennifer showed up at my office one afternoon, her face a mix of rage and desperation. She stormed in, shouting, demanding her money back, threatening to call the police. My coworkers looked on, wide-eyed, as I calmly escorted her to the conference room, pretending to be shocked by her outburst. "Jennifer, I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, feigning innocence as I closed the door behind us. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "The investment, the money I transferred to you. Don't pretend you're innocent." I crossed my arms, raising an eyebrow. "Jennifer, if you're talking about the money you willingly transferred, that was a personal gift, wasn't it? I mean, we're not technically together, so if you wanted to invest, there'd have to be some trust, right?" She froze, realizing too late that she trapped herself. She couldn't accuse me of fraud without implicating herself. And if she tried to go public, I had the therapy records, the proof of her affair, and a string of evidence that would make her look insane. She'd be seen as the desperate ex, trying to claw her way back into a relationship that didn't exist. "I'll ruin you," she spat, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. I leaned in close, lowering my voice. "Jennifer, you already tried, and look where it got you. You wanted everything, my trust, my money, my life. And now, you have nothing." She stormed out of the conference room, and I watched her go, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. This time, it really was over. Jennifer's last hope of regaining control, of clawing her way back into my life, had been obliterated. She'd been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and left with nothing but the ruins of her own schemes. In the months that followed, Jennifer disappeared from my life completely. The news of her failed schemes and public humiliation had left her isolated, with few friends and no allies. She eventually moved out of the city, leaving behind the wreckage of her reputation. As for me, I moved on, finally free from the shadow of her betrayal. The money she'd invested became a starting point for a real venture, one that I controlled, one that didn't involve lies or manipulation. The tech startup grew, and I found fulfillment in building something honest, something that didn't rely on deceit. Looking back, I realized that revenge wasn't about punishing her. It was about taking back control of my life. Jennifer had tried to make me feel small, helpless, trapped in her web of lies. But in the end, she'd only trapped herself. And as I watched my life take shape without her, I felt the weight of her betrayal lift, replaced by something far more powerful, freedom. And in that freedom, I found the ultimate revenge, happiness on my own terms, untainted by the shadow of her lies. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below.